Hello and welcome to a short video from Paper Hen. Today I want to talk about how to use our papercraft patterns as a base for creating a paper mache mask or sculpture. As an example, I'll be showing you how to build a paper mache mask, but the technique works equally well for a paper sculpture. Starting with the base papercraft mask, that is, one which you've built from our pattern, the basic process is to waterproof it, apply paper mache, trim and sand the mask, add holes for a cord, add a waterproof undercoat, paint it and finally varnish it. Here are the tools and materials you'll need to complete a mask. Firstly, you need something to cover your work area since paper mache can get a bit messy. Here I've got a nice plastic table cover which is washable. For waterproofing the base mask you'll need some masking tape. For paper mache you'll need newspaper, PVA or white glue and water. You also need a plastic sealable bucket to keep the mixture in and something to measure quantities with. I just use a plastic cup. To finish the mask before decorating, you'll need some different grades of sandpaper and maybe scissors and a craft knife for trimming some rough parts. If you want to add a tie cord, then you'll need a sharp rounded screwdriver or broad awl to create the holes. For decorating, you'll need gesso to seal the paper mache before painting, acrylic paints and varnish, plus of course brushes. We start with the base mask which I built from cardstock. The mask started life as a pattern which was then printed onto card, cut out, folded and glued. I have a range of masks and sculpture patterns which are available for a few dollars. I'll put a link in the description of where you can find them. As it stands, the mask card is not waterproof. Applying wet strips of paper mache on this will weaken the card and it'll lose its shape. We've therefore got to cover it with something waterproof and sticky. Masking or decorator's tape will do just fine. Cover the mask with strips of masking tapes. Start on the eyes and cover the rest of the mask. One layer is enough. Make sure that there's no gaps between the strips or moisture will get through onto the card. It's useful to have some wide tape and some narrow tape available. Use the wide tape as much as you can, only using the narrow tape in places where otherwise you'd get a crinkle. Usually you'd cover both the outside and inside of the mask with tape. I used diluted PVA or woodworker's glue rather than the traditional flour and water mix for paper mache. The advantages are that it dries quicker, it's a lot stronger, it's water resistant and you can sand it to a smooth finish. The solution you want is a 2 to 3 glue to water ratio. Use a plastic cup to measure out the ratios and keep the solution in a resealable plastic bucket so that it doesn't dry out. Make just enough solution for the project you're working on. Use old newspapers for paper, they're recyclable and are easy to tear into strips. The base material for paper mache are strips of newspaper. We use strips rather than full sheets so that creases don't occur and coverage is better. With dry hands, tear the strips rather than cutting them with scissors. Aim for a strip width of about 2 inches and tear 8 strips at a time. Split the strips into piles based on the layers you're going to use. I'm going to have 3 layers on the outside of the mask. Layer 1 will be 3 strips thick, layer 2 will be 2 strips, layer 3 will be 1 strip, giving 6 strips thick in total. The idea is that the inner layers provide strength whilst the outer layer, being the thinnest, will be smoother. On the inside I'll just use 2 layers. There'll be 2 strips on layer 1 and 1 strip on layer 2. After the first layer has dried, you might decide that the mask is strong enough for your needs. In that case, you'd only do 2 layers rather than 3. Alternatively, you might find that after 2 layers it's not strong enough, so you make the 3rd layer 2 strips and then add a 4th layer. It's a bit of a trial and error process, but for most times I find that 3 outside layers and 2 inside layers are enough. Create enough stacks to cover the mask for the layer you're doing. Since this layer is 3 strips thick, I'll make a dozen or so stacks. Take a stack at a time, submerge it and then separate the strips so that each is well covered and can absorb the solution. You only need to leave the strips in the solution for maybe 10 seconds. Now gently shake the strip and then use your fingers like a squeegee to remove any excess glue. Put the stack to one side. Depending on how quickly you work, you may want to prepare another stack, but for the moment I'll just use one. Now that the mask is waterproof, we'll apply the first layer of paper mache. Looking at the geometry of the mask, you can see that there are some areas which are sharp and narrow whilst others are flat and wide. The general rule is to use wider longer strips for wide flat areas and narrower shorter strips for curved areas. This is so you don't get creases in the paper. Start on the curved narrow areas. The eye region is in 2 parts, the top and bottom. I'll need 2 strips, both about 5 inches long and about 1 inch wide. Tear off the size you need from the stack. Remember that this stack is 3 strips thick. Apply the stack onto the mask by laying it over the surface and lightly running your finger over it. Keep it reasonably tight. Since the mask is symmetrical, I'd usually now do the other eye, but for demonstration I'll do the side of the mask instead. I'll use some wider and longer pieces for the sides of the mask as the surface is quite flat. Here the strips are being placed vertically. On the next layer they'll be placed horizontally, which will give extra strength. I'll continue with applying the strips and come back once that's done. This needs to completely dry before applying the second layer, so put it somewhere warm and where it won't be disturbed. It'll take about 24 hours before it's completely dry. You'll see that the outer strips dry before the inner ones, so do leave it until you're sure that it's all dry. I'll complete the rest of the mask and then come back when it's dry. I'll not show further layers being applied, since it'll just be repeating what we've seen before. Here's the mask with all of its paper mache layers applied. You can see that the mask needs to be trimmed in places. The eye region needs to be cut back, and also any places where the shape isn't what I want should be changed. Use a craft knife to cut the holes in the eyes. Usually you trim the mask after each layer has dried. Here's the trimmed mask ready for sanding. Using a glue-based mixture allows us to sand the surface to give a smooth finish. For the best results you'd sand with progressively finer paper. Sanding paper mache takes little effort and can be done quickly. It's also important not to over-sand. Due to the dust created, you'd usually sand outside or in a well-ventilated area. For rough areas, you start with a coarse 60 grit paper. Just sand the rough areas to give an even finish. Don't sand the smooth areas with the coarse paper. Be careful around the edges, such as the eye region. After smoothing the rough areas, use 80 grit paper to refine the surface further. Sand lightly in a circular motion. Sand the whole of the surface. Use 120 grit paper to give a really smooth finish. Sand in a circular motion as before and cover the whole of the surface. The mask is now rubbed down to a smooth finish. Before we go further, check for weak spots on the mask. Prod around the mask for areas that feel weak or too flexible. If there are any, mark that area with a permanent marker, not anything with ink, and then apply some more paper mache strips to that area. Re-mache weak spots with perpendicular strips as you would elsewhere and leave to dry between layers. Once all weak spots have been fixed, it's time for the final finishing. If you're going to use a cord, ribbon or elastic, then it can be fixed by creating a hole in the mask or using a hot glue gun to stick the ribbon. Use a broad awl or sharp screwdriver to make a hole about 1 centimetre or half an inch from the edge. Use gesso as a sealing undercoat for painting. Paper mache on its own will absorb moisture. It also acts as a base colour for your painting. To make gesso, use this recipe. Take 2 tablespoons of water, 2 tablespoons of plaster of Paris, a small dab of white acrylic paint, then add a tablespoon of white glue. Mix well and put into a resealable container. Obviously for larger amounts, just scale up the quantities, keeping the ratios the same. Don't wash your spoons in the sink as the plaster will still harden. Apply the gesso on the freshly sanded surfaces with a brush. Leave to dry. It should take about 10 minutes for the gesso to be touch dry so you can do the reverse side of the mask. Leave the gesso to dry for about a day before painting. The final step is to paint the mask in whatever style you wish. I'm not going to go through how to paint with acrylics since there are loads of good tutorials on that elsewhere. I'll put a link to a good one in the description of this video. But basically, you first create your base colour, which in my case is gold, and then add detailed work. Finally, you may want to give your mask that extra finesse by using an acrylic varnish. There you have it, a completed paper mache mask using a card template. It's a lot quicker than using moulds and produces great results. And since you have the pattern, you can produce as many masks as you wish. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps you with your next paper mache project.